In the movie The English Patient, Ralph Fiennes promises to save his badly injured mistress, Kristen Scott Thomas. It's 1939 and World War II has recently begun. He leaves her in a cave and walks as fast as he can across the desert to get help. After 3 days, he reaches an English military outpost and immediately demands the officers at the desk to quickly get help for a wounded woman in the desert. When the officers begin to ask questions of this strange, disheveled man with a foreign accent that might be German, Ralph Fiennes becomes increasingly agitated, provoking the officer and his team until they arrest him, handcuff him, and carry him away to a train. Desperate, Fiennes manages to break free and return to the cave to find his mistress dead. So dramatic, so tragic, so compelling. And far be it from me to quibble with the plot line of a celebrated romantic movie. But Fiennes' actions illustrate a classic mistake we make when we need someone to give us something. We focus only on our needs. We give little or no thought to the situation from the other person's perspective. In fact, studies find that, like Fiennes, new negotiators tend to focus on their needs, their problems, their demands, and say the other person should worry about himself. But skilled negotiators know it's essential to understand the other negotiator for at least 4 reasons. It builds trust. It lets you avoid needless misunderstanding. It lets you discover the other's strengths and weaknesses, and it lets you discover hidden solutions. So in this session, we'll look squarely at the other negotiator, that undiscovered continent. We'll look at the high and demanding art of really getting where the other person is coming from in the conflicts, transactions, and negotiations we face. As we'll see, it can illuminate almost everything we do in negotiation. A starting point for that crucial task is the idea that there are some things that every negotiator wants. These include respect, face-saving, and the chance to be heard. Studies find that skilled negotiators spend much more time looking for ways to give their counterparts these things than mediocre negotiators do. Let me illustrate their importance with a story. Years ago, a colleague of mine received an assignment from the New York City Tax Authority. Their tax collectors were having a lot of difficulty with an obscure charge called a sidewalk grate tax. It turned out that if you own a small store in New York City, you typically have a metal door on the sidewalk itself leading down to the basement where you store supplies. Incredibly, the city charged a $10,000 a year tax on each owner's sidewalk grate. Who knew? Every 3 years, the tax authority would send delinquent store owners a collection letter informing them that they owed the city $30,000 for the grate tax. At the bottom of the letter was this: if you wish to discuss the matter, please contact this agent at this number. Not surprisingly, many store owners called and demanded a meeting. They were outraged and embarrassed by this tax. Of course, they hadn't budgeted for it, and they were potentially about to be driven out of business by this very kind of tax. Now, as my colleague learned, the open secret among the tax collectors was that they knew this was a bogus and unfair tax, and it really wasn't worth suing over. So when a store owner came to meet with a tax collector, before the owner even said anything, the tax collector would routinely say, "Look, while you do owe us the full $30,000, I'd be willing to settle today for $15,000. But to the collector's dismay, the store owners would routinely refuse. Often, the tax collectors reported the store owners seemed stubborn, obtuse, pugnacious. What was wrong with these people, the collectors wanted to know? We're offering them 50% off of a debt that they clearly owe. What more do they want? Why are we making so few settlements? As the consultant investigated the problem, she soon discovered the underlying problem. Even more than money, the store owners wanted someone in authority to get how outraged they were at such an obscure, ridiculous, and painful tax. Put yourself in their position, she counseled. You're barely making it in business. You're harried by a dozen hidden costs and taxes every month, it seems. Then one day you open up a scary-looking official letter from the tax man that makes you feel like a deadbeat for failing to pay some fee that no one in his right mind would ever expect. A tax that could kill you. How would you feel? Mere money wouldn't mollify you. You'd want someone to take the time to hear how furious you are and respond accordingly. So when the tax collector doesn't even listen and just jumps to a settlement offer, it may only further humiliate and frustrate you and deny you any sense of victory. No wonder they're telling you to stick it. Her advice? Make any settlement offer you want. But first, let the store owner blow off steam for a while. Show him you really get his frustration. Then discuss the numbers. In all likelihood, not only did this advice actually accelerate the settlement process, it quite probably meant that the tax collectors didn't need to offer such big discounts. In contrast, consider the unfortunate consequences of talks between Mexican and American officials in the 1950s over access to Mexican natural gas fields. Mexico at the time was in a political and economic crisis and badly needed money. U.S. representatives, knowing of this crisis, came to Mexico City with a very weak offer, so weak, in fact, that the Mexican officials protested, saying it was so insulting that they couldn't bring it back to their own people. The American representatives were unmoved. We are strong, wealthy, and powerful. No one else can buy the amount of gas we are offering to purchase. What other choice do you have? So the Mexican government began burning off its own gas, and any chance for a deal at a low price became politically impossible. Now, you might say that turning down such offers is irrational, but that's precisely the point. When other people feel disrespected, ignored, and mistreated, they can act in ways that make little sense to an economist, but that make plenty of sense to normal human beings. And I can prove it. I'm going to briefly describe a simple game I've played with students literally around the world, called the ultimatum game. Imagine that I have $10,000 to give away, and that I'm willing to give it to you and a stranger standing next to you if the two of you can agree on a split. I will let you propose a division of the money to that stranger. That is, you'll say to her, I will get X percent and you will get Y percent. Deal? The stranger will decide whether to accept or reject your offer. If she says yes, then I will give you the money to divide as you've agreed. Then neither of you will get, but if she says no, then neither of you will get anything. You both know that $10,000 is at stake, and you both know these rules. How much will you offer her? Now, I have an economics degree, and I've taught economics at the graduate level, and I can tell you that classical economics theory makes a very clear prediction. It predicts and recommends that you should make a rational offer where you keep $9,999 and offer the stranger $1. After all, $1 is more than $0, and if your stranger is rational, as economists define the term, then it's better to have more material wealth than less, and so yes to the $1 would be the right answer. But what do people in the real world do? Overwhelmingly, I find that my students in America, China, and France, and elsewhere, typically divide the money evenly, 50-50, and almost always their counterparts say yes. Some offer to keep 60% and give 40%. Usually their counterparts say yes, but not always. A few propose to keep 70% and give 30%. Some say yes, but some say no. Usually a couple of students propose to keep 90% and give 10%. More often than not, their counterparts say no deal. When I ask why the counterparts turn down $1,000, $3,000, even $4,000, their answers are invariably the same: because it's not fair. No matter how I press them, arguing the economist's point that some money is worth more than no money, they're invariably unmoved. I would rather go hungry than see that guy get so much, they say. And it turns out that studies of the ultimatum game by social scientists around the world show generally similar results. True, there are some variations depending on culture and income levels, but most people walk away from what they perceive to be unfair deals, even if the deals are nominally profitable. You might think that this result is simply due to the fact that imaginary money is involved. But in one experiment, Indonesian villagers were offered the equivalent of 20% of their annual income. That is, they played for about $60 in real money. Remarkably, they still walked away from deals they felt were unfair. Similarly, studies find that job candidates often care more about fairness than money. Imagine you have two offers, one for a salary of $100,000, where peers will receive $120,000. The other offer is for $85,000, where, like you, peers receive $85,000. Most job candidates select the lower paying job, in large part because they perceive that they are being treated with less respect and fairness at the higher paying job. None of these findings mean that you have to offer the other negotiator a simple compromise that divides everything in half. Quite the opposite. What these studies more suggest is that something more than just money matters to people, and that they will often accept less financially if they feel that they're being treated more respectfully. Now, this point hardly means that you can and should bamboozle people with charm to get over on them financially. We all know how little credibility we give smarmy salesmen with slick smiles and glad hands who seem to be trying to be our instant friend. What the ultimatum game means is that your awareness of the other person's humanness and of the intangible needs that he has may be as important in a negotiation as anything else. One implication is that it's a very good idea to spend time seeking to empathize with your counterpart in the negotiation, as skilled negotiators do. Empathy means deeply seeing things from the other person's perspective. It's not the same thing as a slick salesman's approach, because it's about understanding the other in their world, not fashioning your own slick appearance of friendship. A student of mine bought some roses. Just to illustrate this point, I'll share this story with you. He bought it for his girlfriend for Valentine's Day from a local florist shop and had them delivered to her that evening. She received them with gladness, put them in a vase, and within 6 hours, every petal was on the floor, dead. So, of course, she told him about it, and the next evening, after work, he went back to the flower shop, ready to complain bitterly. But as he approached the shop, he noticed a line of other young men out the door, all angry and muttering about how she won't take my calls anymore, she thinks I'm cheap, and so on. And he quickly realized that something had gone wrong with this flower shop. Then he remembered from his negotiation training the importance of empathy, of psychologically stepping out of one's own shoes and walking around in the others for a while. And so he remembered from summer jobs what it's like to be a clerk and to be wailed on by unhappy customers. And he realized that the last thing this clerk needs is to hear yet another customer angrily saying that the clerk has ruined the customer's relationship. Chances are he already knows that the customers are angry. So when it was finally my student's turn, he said to the clerk, or rather he said later on, he said, "You should have seen the look on the clerk's face as the clerk braced himself for yet another attack." But surprisingly, my student simply said, "It looks like you're having a really hard day." The clerk was stunned. "Oh my gosh," his face seemed to say. "Finally, here's someone who doesn't see me as a speed bump, who actually sees a little of my humanity." And the clerk started to pour his heart out to my student. There was a big mix-up, the clerk said. The supplier promised better quality at lower prices and delivered lower quality flowers instead. I'm new here. The owner of the store isn't here. The sign says that our policy is no return without receipts. And of course, who has receipts for a Valentine's Day purchase? In response, my student simply said, "I wonder what we can do about this. Not, what will you give me, or I'll kill you, but let's collaborate." And so they started to work together, And after a while, they began to realize that the refrigerator had some fresh flowers that were from another supplier. The clerk said, "I think your girlfriend will like them even better, and I think I can convince my boss to use them as a replacement." The store delivered those flowers to my student's girlfriend that afternoon, and she really liked them, and they lasted for several days. Now again, the idea is not to butter people up hoping they'll give us things. You and I can tell when someone is trying to do that, and often they seem as phony as a $3 bill. But can we actually see the other person's humanity and his deep needs? I believe this is a wise thing to do, even if it profits us nothing. And here, let me take my negotiating professor's hat off and speak personally with you for a moment. I believe this is one of the most important things we're called to do in this world, and you may very well do it better than I do, and I hope I'm getting better at it as I go along, even if it profits me nothing. I just think it's an intrinsically meaningful and important thing to do. But as I put my negotiating professor's hat back on, I'll observe that it's a happy coincidence that doing this work is also extremely effective as a way to discover the other person's hidden interests, to discover important research questions, to discover creative options, and to build leverage and rapport, among other things. In The English Patient, Ralph Fiennes had hours, days really, to think about his situation from others' perspectives as he struggled through the desert. Now, I don't mean to kill a romantic story, and yes, I really get that Fiennes was distraught and exhausted by the end of his desert trek. But let's face it, if you really want to save your mistress, then thinking about how others might see you when you reach civilization, and what questions they might have and why they might hesitate, could only help matters. The same is true when we're standing in line waiting to get satisfaction from a clerk. It's tempting to stress out and fume. It takes discipline to go beyond that. So one simple but powerful way to practice empathy before an important negotiation is to simply speak in the voice of the other negotiator as he might confide in a close friend. How does the situation look to you now? What are you worried about? Why does that other person, that is, why do you, seem so difficult? What are your fears, hopes, needs? If you find it really is difficult to do this work, that discovery itself is valuable. It means you probably need to understand him better, and maybe useful to speak with someone who has been in the counterpart's situation. In my student's case, if he had no experience as a clerk himself, he might have been wise to call a friend who had been a clerk himself and ask, "What's it like to be a clerk in a situation like this?" Regardless, as you empathize, you want to take special note of surprises that give you deeper insight into the situation. Now, you might hear all this and say, if I start to empathize with the other person, I'm afraid I'm going to give away the store. But in that case, you're not really empathizing at all. You're sympathizing. You're pitying her. And you're probably paying a needless price for it. As New York Police Department hostage team negotiator Dominic Messino puts it, it's all about empathy, not sympathy. As he says, hostage negotiators, all negotiators for that matter, aren't aiming to sympathize with the person on the other side of the barricade. In a hostage situation, understanding that a person is angry about, say, the fact that his wife wants to leave him, gives the hostage negotiation team a great deal of information and ways of influencing his behavior. All of which brings us back to the idea of skilled empathy. The ability to see things from the other person's perspective does not require us to make ruinous concessions. In fact, you and I may be alive today because somebody was very good at practicing real empathy toward a potentially annihilating enemy. In the outstanding documentary, The Fog of War, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara gives 10 lessons that he learned from his service to President John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson. Rule number 1, empathize with your enemy. To illustrate, he tells the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There, for 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a crisis over the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba targeted at the United States. As McNamara recounts, in the first days of the crisis in mid-October 1962, the Kennedy government mobilized 140,000 Marines and came under tremendous pressure from senior leaders to invade Cuba. Despite his initial more cautious response, by October 27th, Kennedy was convinced that we are not going to be able to get these missiles out through negotiation. He was poised to offer an invasion within 48 hours. But there at the meeting with Kennedy and other advisors was Tommy Thompson, former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who had actually lived with Soviet Premier Khrushchev and his wife on 2 occasions. "I disagree, Mr. President," Thompson said. "I think there's still a chance." "That he'll back down?" said Kennedy. "The important thing to Khrushchev, it seems to me," said Thompson, "is to be able to say, 'I saved Cuba.'" In effect, Thompson was urging Kennedy to ignore an aggressive message from the Soviets that the Americans had received hours earlier, and instead respond to a more conciliatory message from the Soviets that they had received the previous day. As McNamara points out, in Thompson's mind was this: Khrushchev has gotten himself into a hell of a jam. If we can find a face-saving way for him to get out and declare victory, he'll accept that. And Thompson was right. McNamara concludes, "We've got to listen to our enemies and understand the thoughts and motivations behind their actions." It turns out that if we had invaded, we would have discovered that nuclear missiles there were operational in Cuba and that the Soviets and the Cubans were prepared to use them on our troops, which would almost certainly have led to a cataclysmic nuclear war. Thompson's story reaffirms the age-old wisdom Sun Tzu famously shared in his book, The Art of War: know your enemy. All of which means that empathy is not about being a wuss, it's a critical task. So critical, in fact, that in a sense the entire Cold War was governed by a mathematical effort to crystallize empathy using a method known as game theory, in which you intentionally try to play out your choices and how they will affect the choices of your adversary. We can use Thompson's story as the occasion to discover a systematic method for empathizing with others that we're in conflict with, a method known as the currently perceived choice chart. The currently perceived choice chart is a tool advanced by negotiation experts Roger Fisher, Bill Urey, and Bruce Patton. It's essentially a grid that quickly helps you to see how things look from the other's perspective and use the insights to develop a persuasive response. I've adapted it slightly to make a couple of points a bit easier to convey. The first step is simply to ask, what is the choice my counterpart thinks he has to make? In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's counterpart was Nikita Khrushchev, and the question Khrushchev faced was this: shall I agree to withdraw the missiles from Cuba? The second step is to ask, why would my counterpart feel it was bad to say yes to my proposal? If we imagine that we are in the Cuban Missile Crisis and that we're Nikita Khrushchev, then you can see immediately why, if you're Khrushchev, there's a lot to worry about if you agree to withdraw the missiles. You risk losing Cuba to an invasion by the U.S., you lose face with the Politburo, Russians generally, and Russia's allies by backing down. Hawks in the Politburo might try to sack you from losing Cuba, and you gain nothing. The third step is to ask why saying no seems to be a good idea to your counterpart. In Khrushchev's case, refusing to withdraw the missiles seems to protect Cuba from a U.S. invasion. If you're Khrushchev, it lets you look good to your side because you're hanging tough. It likely protects you from losing power, and you save Cuba and get respect. Now, the critical insight is that when we make such lists, we're actually discovering the other person's driving interests. Each of the fears and hopes that Khrushchev had, that we've just enumerated, comes down to some key interests. As Thompson put it, the important thing for Khrushchev is to be able to say, I saved Cuba, I stopped an invasion. With that insight, a solution starts to come into focus. help him, in effect, declare victory by agreeing not to invade if he takes the missiles out. An attractive offer because it addresses the felt needs, fears, and hopes that we've just identified. Another powerful way to deeply understand the other negotiator is to do a role simulation of the upcoming talks where a friend pretends to be you and you pretend to be the person you're getting ready to negotiate with. That is, you do a practice round of negotiation in which you act as the other negotiator and a friend acts as you. Studies of top negotiation instructors suggest that doing a role simulation helps you predict the other person's actions better than almost any other preparation you can do. It also helps you produce better, more attractive options and enhances support, trust, and buy-in. To do it, try using this approach outlined by Professor Stuart Diamond of Wharton. First, find a teammate and share all the basic facts of the upcoming negotiation with her. Second, next, have your teammate prepare as if she were you, while separately you prepare as if you were the person you're going to negotiate with. As we'll see, preparation can take some time, though you can take less time in an emergency. Third, meet in character with your teammate, playing you and you playing the other person. Negotiate, staying in character, and making the best case you can for the side you are pretending to be. Fourth, take occasional breaks to talk about how the talks are going, but stay in character. Then resume. Do the simulation for at least 45 minutes. Finally, drop your roles and reflect together on the experience. Ask each other what helped and what didn't. Trade preparation notes and combine them. As Professor Diamond notes, you don't need people who are experts, you need a fresh pair of eyes. Because most of negotiation is about the people in the process, not expertise. But beyond empathy, there are other things you can do at the meeting itself that can help you better understand the other person and so be more effective. One powerfully valuable task is skilled question asking. One of the most efficient ways to learn a lot from the other person with just a few questions is to use a method called funneling. Here, you start by asking very simple, broad, open-ended questions, that is, questions that don't permit a yes or no answer. The broader, the better. For example, let me just listen first and get your perspective on the matter. Or, I'd like to understand your situation. Or, tell me about your needs. Or, tell me about the apartment, the position, the problem. The advantage is that broad, open questions help you avoid making false assumptions and lunging at the wrong answer. They help you learn a lot about the other person's thinking. Now, it's certainly true that not everyone you negotiate with wants to share a lot of information, but most of us warmly value a listening ear. And even if the other side is seemingly reluctant to say very much, insights can emerge from what they do share and what they don't. After a while, it's useful to follow up with somewhat narrower open-ended questions. For example, you could say, "You said you're concerned about the upfront costs. Can you say more about that, please?" Now you're getting into the details, but you're still not assuming a lot. You can keep this approach up for a while, and then, when you have a clear idea of the situation, you can follow up with the most narrow questions, closed questions. That is, questions that do permit a yes or no or numerical or one-word answer, such as, do you have other buyers? How many miles does the car have? And so on. Funneling is a method used widely by helping professionals such as lawyers, doctors, and psychologists. But what if you genuinely cannot empathize with the other side? Or what if they have grave doubts that you can ever truly understand them? One way to cope is to enlist the help of a third party who can empathize. For example, consider the book Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft by Douglas Johnston and Cynthia Sampson. In it, the authors demonstrated that it is possible to improve relations between Westerners and Muslims in an unexpected way by intentionally involving clergy from other faiths. They recount a variety of case studies where bringing believers of different faiths together helps prevent or resolve conflicts by demonstrating deep connection through shared religious values. In about 2007, Johnston, as head of an NGO, went to Karachi, Pakistan, and visited several Muslim madrasas that were closely identified with terrorism. One in particular was known to be the chief supplier of fighters in Kashmir and Chechnya, and members of the most violent anti-Shiite terrorist groups. He and his colleagues met with madrasa leaders who were filled with rage against U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. To diffuse that rage, he first acknowledged the leaders' anger. He noted, too, reasons why Muslim nations might also be criticized, and then said this: "We're here to try to build on religious values that we have in common to see if we can improve our relationship." Then he quoted from the Quran, which he summarized says this: "O mankind, God could have made you one had he willed, but he didn't. He made you into separate nations and tribes that you may know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works." Johnston proceeded to challenge the madrasa leaders to a friendly competition in good works. Within an hour, their rage had turned to a remarkable spirit of near fellowship. The leader of a similar madrasa was so moved by a similar encounter that he led the school to sponsor seminars in peacemaking and conflict resolution. A third leader came to Johnston and said, "You have made me so very, very happy. We thought all Americans hated us." One reason the surprising approach seems to have worked is that these Muslim clerics apparently assumed that Westerners were all decadent rationalists who have no understanding of the spiritual life or devotion to Scripture, and therefore would be hard-pressed to understand Muslim values and feelings. Involving people with faith traditions who understood religious life and who, like the Muslims, have an Abrahamic tradition, actually helped build bridges most thought impossible to build. This idea that an ally who gets the other side can help you when you can't get them yourself lies behind the old tradition of using a liaison who figuratively and literally speaks the other's language. One implication? Choose a teammate, an agent, or involve a third party who deeply understands your counterparty, who really gets them, and who can show them that someone on your side understands. Here then is my challenge for this session. Let's call it the "What does the other person want and why" challenge. The next time you're gearing up for an important negotiation, see what happens if you intentionally spend time listing the other person's likely interests, doing some research about her, speaking in her voice, perhaps even playing her part in a role play with one of your allies, and intentionally seeking to learn about her needs early on in the talks. What does it take to do that, and what effect does it have on your results? Any efforts to understand the other person is incomplete unless we add that most skilled negotiators consider it to be one of the most important negotiating skills of all, and that is skilled listening. In fact, that skill has so many other benefits and advantages that we can almost call it a secret weapon. In our next session, we'll see why, and we'll discover what makes skilled negotiators' listening skills so much more effective and how you can develop them too.